Thanks. Hi everyone, thank you Denise for such important work, really inspirational, thank you. Thanks also for having me, Team Contemporary Art Society at Courtauld. Pleasure to be here, and it's been a pleasure dealing with you, Vasilius. I, in a way a little bit like Denise, would like to think that my work tackles that nagging question that nothing's being said. And I guess by naming the unspoken, I want to think about whether or not museums can affect social change. I would suggest that they could. I would argument that they can be instruments even of positive social change, sites of learning, discovery, and places to better and broaden our understanding. They're not, by their very nature, unbiased. We all know that. But I guess by not talking, we're not suggesting that they're silent. On the contrary, museums can either choose to foster or to tackle social othering. Art and identity have always been inextricably linked. To argue that identity politics has no place in the museum is to perhaps suggest that we ought to take down every family portrait that hangs on their walls. Ultimately, museums can remain silent about the gaps and traps in their collecting and their collections, or they can neglect to acknowledge how loud that silence is, or they can choose to speak out. And to unpack these ideas, I'd like to talk to you about the Museum of Transology as my case study today. A little bit about the collection first. It began by collecting objects from Brighton's own trans community. It's the largest trans community in the UK. Very vibrant, very confident community. It now consists of over 250 objects chosen by more than 110 trans people to represent their gender identities. It's the largest of its kind in the world. It's also as complex and diverse as the experiences of the people it represents, with objects of social history, dress and textiles, medicine, beauty products, personal ephemera, human remains, paper and art, including, for example, photography by Bharat Sikka. But it's absolutely united by themes of hope, despair, confidence, ambition. Each object, as you can see, comes with a metaphoric tag attached to it that displays a handwritten explanation of its significance to the person who donated it. It makes the ordinary objects extraordinary. Brought together, the individual experiences provide a revelatory account of how gender politics is evolving in the UK today. Indeed, I would suggest that this collection marks the biggest shift in gender awareness since second wave feminism. A quick look at the aims: to tackle directly the misunderstanding and marginalisation of trans people that results in profound levels of discrimination, violence and inequality. To redress the neglect of trans history and narratives within the museum and heritage sector, despite art collections being full of them. To encourage trans people and their families into the museum. When you don't see yourselves on the wall of the museum, why would you even want to go? To build sustainable partnerships with queer communities, to provide volunteer training to trans people, diversifying the museum and heritage sector. Without having trans people work in the sector, well, to use probably a phrase that's a little bit crass, it takes one to know one. So you're overlooking opportunities to spot those narratives, and to allow trans people to tell their own stories as a way of challenging the media spectacularisation of their lives and bodies. Ultimately, to engage with modern debates surrounding gender and identity. In his article, Museum Social Responsibility and the Future We Desire, the author Robert James makes a link between the forces of capitalism and the measuring of a museum's worth and success in terms of the market forces that breed spectaculars and shows as a form of dazzling entertainment. And he contrasts this with the social responsibility of museums that should aim to be more inclusive and help to build stronger communities. He suggests that museums ought to be concerned with the management of the hierarchy of wisdom, moving beyond labelling and education to incorporating the moral, social and practical dimensions of solving life problems in an expert fashion, making the moral, social and practical legacies of human society both visible and accessible. Being socially responsible can mean facilitating civic engagement, acting as an agent of social change, or moderating sensitive social issues. The values of a socially responsible museum, then, include idealism, intimacy, depth, and interconnectedness. It's no coincidence, I would argue, that the lack of socially irresponsible lack of conversations in museums surrounding gender diversity aligns with gross misconceptions of the trans, non-binary and intersex people in the tabloid media and society at large. To quote Richard Sandel, Senior Professor of Museum Studies at Leicester Uni, there are now increasingly bold and explicit claims that are beginning to explore the museum's impact on the lives of individuals and communities and the role that cultural organisations are playing in tackling specific manifestations of inequality, such as racism and other forms of discrimination, poor health, crime and unemployment. For the trans community, a rise in tabloid visibility has led to a rise in real-life vulnerability, and the supposed trans tipping point has resulted in a widespread campaign of hate levied against members of the LGBT community that we haven't seen since Section 28 or the AIDS crisis. Museums must fight back because exclusion from the museum reflects exclusion from society. Hidden history is a form of othering. It's a question of ethical good practice. According to Anne Lawrence, in Women in England in 1500 to 1760, A Social History, the term hidden history is used when the history of a hitherto neglected group begins to appear, as, for example, in the case of Black history, women's history, lesbian and gay history. The phrase is not simply used to describe the group's emergence into mainstream history. It also has an explicit message that these groups have lacked history because society has been unwilling to see them as a separate group with particular rights. Groups hidden from history are hidden for three reasons. They're hidden because of prejudices against the group in the past, because of modern prejudices, and because of the absence of records. I personally would probably like to make a call to stop using the term hidden history. We're not children playing hide and seek in life's playground. This is censored history. It's erasure. I was motivated to build this collection because despite the trans tipping point having been tipping for around 15 years now, I didn't see museums collecting trans stories or artefacts. Without objects, in 100 years' time, historians would be left again to rely largely on the media that spectacularises trans lives, or the medical world that pathologises them, to provide the historical evidence they need. Both sources inevitably employ a cis gaze projected through the lens of titillation surrounding the exposé of trans and intersex bodies. It's been going on for hundreds of years, and it's well time the ethics of this were addressed. So here we see the rise of scientific illustrations that featured lettering in the mid-18th century, and how this visual communication contributed to the rise of intersex visibility and the shift from monster and myth to a valid, spectacular subject worthy of study. And it was the addition in particular of the placement of the identifying letters amid the trappings of luxury and conventions of Rococo portraiture, be it erotic or otherwise, that signalled to 18th century viewers the intermediate space that this illustration occupied between scientific and popular, read pornographic, imagery. Easy to miss, once seen, impossible to ignore. These small inscriptions changed the context of the image for the viewer. A seemingly lewd image became one intended for study. And yet, nearly 2 centuries later, 3 in fact, even when this spectacular moment in Western gender history now neatly and conveniently coincides with the 50-year anniversary of the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality in Britain and Wales, still there was scant evidence that museums were collecting the material culture of today's gender diversity or had the in-house expertise to do so. This moment threatened to slip through the archival gap and into the historical abyss, allowing the persistence of the methodological justification that as rigorous historians, we simply can't locate trans identities retrospectively as the word didn't exist back then. So that was my motivation for collecting, to ensure from at least this day forward the academic justification of ongoing erasure could be put to bed. In the overly familiar words of Howard Zinn, archives are biased towards the important and powerful people of society, tending to ignore the ignorant, impotent and obscure. I would add the heterosexual, not the homosexual, the cisgendered, not the transgendered. His overriding point is that leveraging the power of the archive is not the politicisation of an inevitably neutral craft, but the humanising of an inevitably political craft. But in contrast to Zinn, I would advocate community collecting and curation is a form of activism that can proactively readdress this imbalance. It appears that no longer will the impotent and obscure be the passive and the ignored. And right now we're witnessing a new wave of collecting mania in British history, not seen on this scale publicly since the Victorian period. Note the Vagina Museum, the Museum of Homelessness, the Ruckus Archives built by Topher Campbell and Ajamu X, the Museum of Ordinary People, to name just a few. Collecting is back, and history's really now. The problem with pop-up exhibitions is that they pop down. Objects make history, and collections save them. For the trans community, not collecting this moment in trans time would have been to let it slip into the historical abyss yet again. It's therefore of the utmost significance that the MOT, even though it's only 4 years old, the collection itself includes objects that are significantly older. Indeed, upon embarking upon the collecting process, I swiftly discovered a vibrant, undocumented, widespread culture of collecting already existed in the trans community. Upon reflection, it's perhaps unsurprising. When one considers the extraordinariness of the trans experience, the deep personal reflection and inner determination fundamental to the process of declaring oneself trans, something that anyone who's queer would be familiar with, it's no wonder that trans people become passionate about the possessions that record their process of becoming. Trans people may not have been appearing in museum narratives, but they nonetheless have been saving their own stories, proactively readdressing the neglect of trans history outside the academy. They were already the curators of their memory, already the collectors of their evidence, already material culturalists, converting the daily ephemeral into the museological perennial. I'm giving up my blue earring. It's very special to me, as I've worn it to Brighton for Trans Pride, the first ever one, which is a great deal for me. That little earring, it doesn't even have a back on it, it's not even silver, it wouldn't have cost £2 from Sally's, right, has been carefully put away in this kid's drawer for over 6 years, and trans kids don't necessarily have stable lives. They've really, really, really held on to it and looked after it. But the moment the opportunity came for them to give it to the Museum of Transology, they couldn't have done it fast enough. So what we're seeing here is a reflection that they were not only saving the story for themselves, they were desperate to tell it to other people. In other words, they were desperate to see themselves on the walls of a museum. In 1968, Jean Baudrillard summarised this exact phenomenon of trans people saving their own transcestry when he stated that, and I quote, "The whole miracle of collecting is that it is invariably oneself that one collects." Trans artist Simon Croft concurs when he says about his jacket, "Suited is made from packaging from about 4 years of my personal usage of testosterone. Masculinity fits me like a good suit." Baudrillard extends his idea, stating that the unique object epitomizes the set to which it belongs. So it is that this first ever single vial of testosterone, and when the package arrived, it was in a big box, it was completely wrapped up with sticky tape, and then slicing it open, there's all these foam peanuts, and it's like, what's in the box? There's this tiny, tiny little single vial of his first ever testosterone vial, and he'd saved it and then given it to us. But it was so precious, couldn't risk it being broken. So it is this first vial of testosterone swiftly grew to become dozens of packets of hormones with hugely varied stories attached to them, until it clearly developed into a significant collection in its own right, requiring its own display case. United by material matter, the voices shared an experience that nonetheless were unique to each user. The donors' voices created a rich narrative that extended beyond a curatorial text panel that would inevitably say something like, "Some trans people take hormones to transition, full stop." The nuance could only be captured by the community. A cisgender curator would have overwritten it, unwittingly, no doubt. I would suggest that the object's expert is the person who used it, with use trumping manufacture, consumption trumping production. The age of the passive visitor has passed. Audiences who are being represented want to be actively involved in exhibition making. And audiences bring with them agendas and knowledges. The Museum of Transology has over 110 curators. They are the object experts. They chose the material for the show. Top-down curation is increasingly being questioned. And it was precisely for this reason that the Museum of Transology's collecting policy was to accept and display every object that was offered by any person who identified as trans. It was intended to empower the donors to tell the stories that mattered to them, unedited. Collecting everyday objects was also a deliberate strategy employed to demystify trans lives. The power of everyday objects lies in the ability they have to build a relationship between the subject and the viewer. The familiarity of the objects on display and the part they play in most people's everyday lives combats the misrepresentation and othering of trans lives by their sheer relatability. Everyone can look at a lipstick, and it's not a lipstick that's Yves Saint Laurent, it's a lipstick that's been kicking around in the bottom of someone's handbag for too long that came from Boots, and you go, "Oh, I know what you've got what I've got, what?" Right? And so it's this familiarity that builds the relatability. You know, every teenage kid thinks their mum's choice of clothes and boxer shorts for them is tragic. These objects are mundane, they're human, normal, and routine. So the donor of this can of links explains its significance. "This was the first boy product I bought. It was for a drag king night, and it was such a life-changing event. It felt so good dressing as a boy and broke down some invisible barrier I had against boy stuff, opening doors, smelling great," and they've drawn a little strong arm next to it. I would suggest it's not a can of deodorant. It's a can of growing up, a can of hitting puberty, a can of finding oneself. It proves that all pubescent boys, trans or not, think that Link smells good. If a museum is a classifying house that constructs rationality, then the introduction of objects with their stories attached to them can deconstruct irrational classification or counteract exclusion from being worthy of a category at all. as is the case of trans people and their erasure from history through the non-collection of artefacts or denial of their existence in collections. And that, in turn, can reconfigure their irrational status in society. As Foucault posits, there is a possibility of recategorization if we recognize that we look through a lens of rationality that is particular to our time and culture, that we can break up all the ordered surfaces and all the planes with which we are accustomed to tame the wild profusion of existing things and collapse and threaten our age-old distinction between the same and the other. To not be included in the walls of the museum, to be overlooked in collections and ignored in your community's place in history making. After all, who hasn't been touched by the transgender revolution? Oh my God, genderless toilets, what on earth next, man? Preferred use of pronouns? To not be included on the walls, to be othered, left out, abnormalised, excluded, is to be posited as unworthy, and trans people have been the historical untouchables. And this is precisely why the trans movement is so fundamentally important to the UK's own social history. It's challenging our preconceived notion of what's male and female, and fundamentally suggesting that these categories are constructions. How would we have to recategorise museums to address this? How can we open up the possibilities of new ways of reading gender in museums? How many text panels will we have to rewrite? This is complicated by the idea that if the aims of a museum is to conserve and protect and show how things stay the same, then how can they be spaces that understand change? In so many ways they don't and they can't, but this doesn't mean they couldn't. I'd advocate that this contemporary collection of functional used objects is both political and post-colonial because it was made by the people, for the people, with the people's consent. It's a use of display as an effective means of articulating values at a time of change, with past values embedded in the authority of the institutionalised space being reconciled with today's gender experiences. A use of collecting and curating as a form of direct action and non-violent resistance. And as such, collectivism, the combination of collecting and activism, suggests that museology can contribute to the repertoire of contention, curating protest for positive social change. Thank you.